Hyperbole is an amazing way to get views for a video, but I promise this isn't exaggeration. The 2004 DC Comics miniseries Identity Crisis might be the worst comic book I've ever read. I should start with the positives. The art isn't awful. It's not exactly my cup of tea. On the Scott McCloud graph of artistic styles, the ones I tend to favor fall somewhere around here, where Rags Morales, at least for Identity Crisis, is sort of going for a photorealistic thing, while not going as hard as Alex Ross or Drew Struzan. Sometimes I get the feeling he forgot what a face looks like Connor Hawke has one eye that looks vaguely like a human eye, and the other is just over here doing its own thing. It's not every panel, but just often enough to be really distracting. Still, the art is the best thing about the book. This comic fails in a number of ways, and I intend to dissect each way it does so. First, as a mystery story. I've said before, I prefer fair play mysteries that give the audience all the clues necessary to solve it before the detective starts explaining whodunit. Even if your name is Edgar Allan Poe and you decide the culprit was a monkey with a straight razor, that's cheating if we could not have deduced that based on what you told us before. Any mystery story will throw a couple of red herrings your way. That is, a false lead you and the story's detective are meant to take seriously, but it's only a distraction to keep you looking too hard at the actual culprit. Identity Crisis is 99% red herrings. There are no actual clues. There's not any detective work. Just 6 issues of our heroes, and I use that term loosely, blundering around, and 1 issue of everyone moving on with their lives after the Fiend accidentally implicates themselves. Spoilers if you care, and I hope you have a strong stomach. There's some stuff that's hard to get through. Our story begins with Elongated Man and Firehawk watching D-list supervillain Bolt about to buy some merchandise from some thugs. This has little to do with the rest of the story, but I found it distracting. Bolt heavily implies he's planning on robbing these clowns. Well, I'm not going to say I condone shooting somebody 1,000 times, but they understandably shoot the guy who is planning on robbing them, and Bolt acts confused. If I hinted I was going to steal something from someone, and they preemptively acted against me, I wouldn't be surprised. But that's not important. Bolt and the stolen Lex Luthor armor don't show up again for the rest of the story. Simultaneously, Elongated Man's wife Sue Dibney is violently murdered, seemingly burned alive. This prompts a group of former Justice Leaguers to believe the murderer was Dr. Light because he assaulted her in an especially violent and horrible way in the past. The Justice Leaguers who caught and apprehended him decided to alter his brain on the off chance he tried this again. In the present day, these clowns think maybe Zatanna's magic stopped working, and since Sue was burned alive, maybe Light used his powers to effect this. Because the book operates in a sort of non-linear fashion, I'm confused on what happened next. From Sue's funeral, this group goes to Dr. Light's hideout, and somehow he knows they're coming for him. He hires Deathstroke the Terminator to protect him. Deathstroke wipes the floor with the heroes in some of the weakest writing I've ever seen. Deathstroke is supposed to be a capable fighter. He once managed to take out most of the Titans one by one and by surprise, but against 8 Justice Leaguers, somehow he's able to take them all out in a matter of seconds. Yeah, this super soldier serum might make him quicker than the average bear, but fast enough to impale Flash with a sword? Why does Green Lantern think he needs to get 3 millimeters away from Deathstroke to use his long-range weapon? Realistically, Zatanna, Green Lantern, Flash, or Black Canary could have taken Deathstroke alone, but for some reason, this story needs Deathstroke to have the upper hand for the better part of an issue. Seeing the League finally gang up on Deathstroke and start wailing on him, Dr. Light remembers what they did to him in the past. He effectively disappears for the rest of the story. He is not important here other than as a red herring. That's fine, but usually in a real mystery, the red herring is somehow resolved by the end. The Nero Wolf story, The Golden Spiders, Wolf is hired to solve the murder of a young boy. Over the course of the investigation, he accidentally stumbles on a massive blackmailing scheme, which is handed over to the cops so Wolf and his associates can continue their investigation. They don't shrug their shoulders. Well, that's not important. Let's keep looking for our murderer. I'm getting old, and I'm getting older too. I don't have the enthusiasm to chase down every 1,000 issues that ties in with every other 1,000 issues I'm reading. When I was a young lad, if I was reading some issue of X Factor, and they referenced what was happening in an X-Men Avengers whatever, I got excited. I would track it down. I loved exploring the world and the connections in it. Now, I'm much more interested in just reading a story. A full story. If I pay $25 for this, I want to get the whole thing. I don't want to get to the end and find out there are stray threads that will continue in a dozen other series. Dr. Light attacking Sue in the past, getting his brain scrambled, then getting better, that's a big deal and should have been dealt with here. There are other things as well. Not sure what the significance of the stolen Luthor armor is, if it even is significant.
Then he told me of the significance.
It will be significant.
The fallout of the League mind-wiping Batman because he caught them doing it to Dr. Light, that is just barely touched on here and gets explored more in the JOA comics from around this time. I get it, when you're working in a big shared universe and you drop a big enough bombshell, its effects will, or at least should, be felt across the rest of the universe. But when all of the dramatic fallout of this story is felt everywhere except this story, it kind of makes this story feel a little hollow. It's doubly frustrating when I'm reading it 20 years after the fact, and I have to go down a rabbit hole to figure out, okay, what happened to Dr. Light? What happened to the Atom? Did Firestorm get better after his little explosion? This story is interested in making a big mess and leaving it for other creators to clean up. Again, there should be some mess that spills over into other books. It would be really weird if Elongated Man was in the Justice League book cracking jokes after his wife was violently murdered here. You want to think what happens here matters and has an impact when reading other stories, but you want this story to actually feel like a story without a dozen different threads left unresolved. Dr. Midnight is autopsying Sue and finds out she didn't have smoke in her lungs, so she wasn't burned to death. While this tells the League what didn't happen, it's not enough of a twist in the story to tell them where they should focus their investigation, so we have to wait for the plot to fall into their laps. We're introduced to Captain Boomerang, a sad sack nobody wants to hire for assassinations. He has an illegitimate son who he spends some time with. We spend some time with Tim Drake, whose dad recently found out he is Robin. Then Jean Loring, the Atom's ex-wife, is attacked in her home. Someone wearing gloves apparently did this. That will be important later. The assailant she describes was once in the Suicide Squad, and even though our heroes are now pretty sure Dr. Light had nothing to do with Sue Dibney's death, they, for some reason, make a connection. Well, Dr. Light was in the squad, Slipknot was in the squad, maybe the Suicide Squad had something to do with this. Batman shows up to say the squad does not benefit from these attacks, and they have to find who benefits, and that's our bad guy, at least according to author Brad Meltzer. Not to question the world's greatest detective and the mastermind behind the worst mystery I've ever read, but finding someone who benefits from the crime happening is not the be-all end-all of solving a mystery. That's maybe a third of the detective work. You find someone who has means, motive, and opportunity. The who benefits question only covers the motive, but even if that was all you needed to solve a mystery, not to get ahead of myself, but when we get to the whodunit, I don't think I can genuinely say we could logically ask ourselves who benefits and arrive at the person behind it all. But none of that matters since this story does not have any real detective work. Green Arrow asks Hal Jordan, currently slumming it as the vengeance of God, to tell him who killed Sue, but Hal's not allowed. Lois Lane gets a threatening note that implies the note sender knows who Superman is. The heroes rough up some villains, but get no closer to finding out who's behind all this. The Atom and his ex-wife rekindle things, and presumably, at the same time the Atom goes off, so does Firestorm. Look, I'm not proud of that joke, let's just move on. We find out Captain Boomerang's son has super speed, which this comic does not bother explaining the significance of.
It will be significant.
I had to Google, oh, there's a Flash villain who has super speed, she's his mom. Okay, thanks for the non-explanation. And it's not like Boomerang Jr. is important in this story. Brad Meltzer says the father-son dynamic is important to him, and you can kind of see that with Jack and Tim Drake, the Green Arrows, and with the Boomerangs. But to this mystery story, Boomerang is just another distraction, another thread that goes nowhere in this story, presumably for someone else to pick up elsewhere. But if you're going to waste time on this super speed scene, then it needs to be explained properly. Jack Drake gets a gun in the mail with a note telling him to protect himself. Boomerang, who, when he wasn't bonding with his son, spent the whole story whining about not being paid to kill people anymore, finally gets hired to kill someone, Jack Drake. Boomerang and Drake end up killing each other. Robin cries, Boomerang Jr. cries, and this is when we finally find out the League messed with Batman's memories when he walked in on them with Dr. Light. If you're wondering when Batman found out they did this to him, or if he somehow found out why they did this to him, so am I. The story implies Superman and Batman already know all this these Leaguers are trying to keep from them. In the New Krypton stuff a few years after this story, Superman was on a planet on the other side of the sun and heard a cry for help on Earth. So yeah, I'd say he knows what Wally and Ollie are talking about. But when did these two find out? The Crisis of Conscience story that deals with Batman finding out about this has him quit the League in the present day. But why? If you've known for some time, why quit now? The reason is Meltzer and Morales only introduced this idea now, so Batman couldn't have quit the League years before anybody knew this happened. While I don't mind the idea of something morally reprehensible tearing the League apart, then they work past it and eventually work together again, something kind of like the Tower of Babel story, it should probably all come out in the present day. Batman and Superman knowing for an undisclosed amount of time makes very little sense. I guess maybe Batman wants to still work with these people because keep your friends close and your enemies closer, but I just don't buy that. The rationale for Batman Batman's paranoia presented in Tower of Babel always worked for me. It's not that Batman doesn't trust the League, he works with them, saves the galaxy with them on a weekly basis. He trusts them with his life. It's that at any moment, mirror universe versions of them might attack their world. Fifth-dimensional imps might control their brains. Red kryptonite might cloud their judgment. There's any number of reasons for Batman to have his failsafes to use against his teammates, but for them to actually act against him as a rationale for his creation of an evil satellite that studies and gathers intel on superhumans, and he decided to continue working with them, that's a bridge too far, I think. This is when Dr. Midnight finally sees little tiny footprints on Sue Dibney's brain, and simultaneously, somehow, Batman also figures out a microscopic person was responsible for her death. I have no idea how Batman arrives at this. Again, there is no detective work here. He suddenly just knows what Dr. Midnight found in the autopsy. Now our heroes think the Atom killed her, and I already whined about this book being nothing but misdirections and red herrings, but even for this book, this is pretty weak, because immediately Batman says, no, it's not the Atom. How he knows this, I have no idea, because we don't see any detective work. Batman is just suddenly in a room with a note from the calculator. Then he's looking at pictures of Sue's corpse, not even close-ups of her brain, when he suddenly realizes it was a tiny person. Then he somehow magically knows it wasn't Ray who did this. Since Batman justifiably has a hard time trusting his friends right now, I'm not sure why or how he ruled out Ray as a suspect. Ray as the culprit would make about as much sense as the actual villain, which, if you don't know, is Ray's ex-wife, Jean. Apparently, Jean missed her ex-husband, who she amicably divorced, who is not seeing anybody at the moment, who she could have asked out for a cup of coffee, see if there's any interest in reigniting, oh, poor choice of words, sorry Ronnie, of shooting her shot, oh, poor choice of words, sorry Boomerang, of, you get the idea, but no, she thinks of the next best thing. She'll attack Sue Dibney, and that will get Ray worried, and he will come running back to her in all of the chaos. I'm a little confused about how this happened. What was she trying to do specifically? I know scare Sue, but why traipse around in her brain? You borrowed Ray's Atom suit, you can be any size. Attack her at 3 feet tall. Just punch her in the face a couple of times. Then run away. Break a few plates. Make it look like an attempted robbery. There's no need to be inside Sue. Oh, poor choice of words. Sorry, Ralph. How is the who benefits question supposed to point back to Jean Loring? She accidentally kills Sue, burns the body to cover up her tracks. I can only assume Jean didn't know about the Dr. Light incident, and it was just a happy accident for her that this looked like something he would do. Then she had to keep going to further push suspicion away from her. She sent the note to Lois, faked an attack on herself, which this is just plain cheating, because we saw the gloved hands choking her, and then, just a page later, she's not wearing gloves. It's one thing if we're shown a gloved assailant when the League is discussing what Jean told them, that's typical unreliable narrator territory. But this is just us watching the attack happen, and because Meltzer cannot write his way out of a wet paper bag, let alone a halfway, nay, a quarter-way decent mystery, he has to cheat every step of the way so that we don't see dainty ladyfingers choking on the rope, and we might for a second think the culprit is a woman, and our choices of whodunit would be drastically narrowed down. Anyway, Jean's a psychopath who acts like Ray is making a mountain out of a molehill. Oh, Ray, it's no big deal, so I got Jack Drake killed and violently murdered our dear friend. At least we're back together. Ray has her committed, then he disappears, and I vaguely recall a series where DC's version of the Exiles were searching the multiverse for him, but I have no idea why, and I don't remember hearing anything good about that. I guess we should thank Jean for accidentally revealing she knew about the note she sent Jack Drake. Otherwise, she would have kept terrorizing the heroes and their loved ones. Ollie would have told Wally about all the other human rights violations the League did. It never would have ended. The story leaves a bad taste in your mouth that makes it difficult to go back to stories you like featuring these characters, because in the back of your brain, you're thinking of Hawkman arguing to violate Batman's memories, or poor Sue Dibney's attack from Dr. Light. I never cared about Jean Loring, but I'm sure somebody out there liked the Silver Age Atom stories and wouldn't like seeing how she was written here. Brad Meltzer talks about how he loved the stories of yesteryear and how he wanted them back, and man, I don't think I can think of a more bizarre way of showing your love for these stories than by writing this story. I guess I should be glad most of the characters I like are hardly touched by this story. Well, that's not true. I enjoyed Sue and Ralph's hijinks in the JLI follow-ups around the time this comic came out, and it sure is hard to go back to those stories that are actually fun when you're thinking of this dreadful trash. Much like in the actual story, I don't have a proper conclusion here. Also, like this story, we have a villain, it's acknowledged, and then we all just unhappily go on with our lives. At least I can trade Identity Crisis in for store credit, which I guess Ray did the closest thing to that without resorting to human trafficking. He drops her off at Arkham, hopes she doesn't tell Killer Croc that Superman is Clark Kent, then he can just go to the multiverse and it's party time. Woohoo! Who among us hasn't had a violent psychotic murderer for a wife? I really hated the New 52 from, 12, 13 years ago. It was a sort of kind of almost reboot that wanted to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start over where it was convenient for them while still referencing and acknowledging some of the stuff that came before. And I was the one person saying, no, you don't have to go that far. You can still salvage this. But then I'm reminded of this story and I say, wow, yeah, getting back to our baby in bathwater analogy, that baby is very ugly. Just get rid of all of it. I don't know. I'm in a bad mood. This story sucks. I have no idea why this was ever approved. What made Meltzer think he needed to put this out there? All the behind the scenes stuff is just as confusing as the story itself. I think I've rambled long enough. If you like this, stick around. I might have other meltdowns in the future. Until then, have a good one.